some fun entertainment this evening. I'm going to give everybody just a minute to log on. So we have a few different platforms we're working with tonight. So some of you have joined us in Zoom, so welcome to our Zoomers, and thank you very much, Colin, who's going to be leading our session here tonight. Please feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A in Zoom, and I will try and get those over to him. Those of you who are watching on Facebook, feel free to put in the chat any questions that you have. We'd love to know where people are watching from tonight, so feel free to drop us a hello and let us know where you are. We're very excited to be here with you on another Yale Alumni Live. Some of you may have joined us earlier this week for an awesome session with Tara Falcone, who did 15 minutes of finance. And tonight we have something really special. I'm very excited to welcome Colin Spoelman, class of 2001. Colin came to Yale from Kentucky, that is relatively, I would say, well known for moonshine and bourbon. I think I heard that somewhere along the line. And Colin is the co-founder of Kings County Distillery and business. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Colin. I'm going to hand it over to you to tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're doing over there in Brooklyn, and we're going to have an awesome tour tonight, and Colin's going to tell you just how you can pick the right whiskey or bourbon or moonshine when we're all back out at the bars and restaurants enjoying ourselves. So thank you so much for being here, Colin. Over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was a great intro. So yeah, I'm a distiller. Kings County Distillery is the oldest craft distillery in New York City, but it is only 10 years old. So it's not a historical institution necessarily. And so I did grow up in Kentucky, and I grew up more in the moonshine, coal mining, Appalachian part of the state, as opposed to the horse racing, bluegrass, bourbon part of the state, which is the maybe the more well-known part of Kentucky. But they're kind of two sides of the same coin, and moonshine is really just another word for unaged bourbon. It's bourbon before it goes in the barrel, or corn whiskey. And I was always fascinated. The county that I grew up in was actually a dry county. And so there were no liquor stores, of course, but there were no bars or even really restaurants, because if you can't sell alcohol with food, people don't really go out. So it was a very different culture of drinking. And then after I moved to New York, there's a bar in every corner, and there's not a lot of moral association with drinking. And so it was very different. And I got very intrigued by that cultural distinction. And so when I would go back to Kentucky, because it was a dry county, there were still bootleggers, and bootleggers are, there were bootleggers and moonshiners. Bootleggers just sell it, but moonshiners make it. And so I would bring this sort of Appalachian moonshine back to Brooklyn and share it with people. And 10 years ago, that sort of struck a nerve, and an interesting one, because it was kind of the moment that the farm to table movement was kind of picking up steam, and things that were made on a smaller scale, according to an older tradition, really resonated. And moonshine, in a way, is the sort of handcraft version of sort of the commercial world of bourbon, which is more, has been very commercialized for a long time. So kind of by sharing this Kentucky moonshine with people, that got me intrigued with kind of the idea of home distilling or hobby distilling. And we've heard of home brewing. That was legalized by Jimmy Carter in the 1980s. And that really sparked up the craft brewery movement. But even to this day, to distill anything at home is still a federal crime. And to do so is to be a moonshiner. And so, but the internet kind of made it possible for people to communicate anonymously and kind of share tips. And so there was this kind of subculture of people who were distilling illegally. But they were kind of sharing tips, and it was kind of a funny little world to get into. And I didn't necessarily have a thought of starting a craft distillery, but after a couple years really of playing around and having fun with it, that was when my Yale roommate, David Haskell, said, there's actually probably a business behind this. And if you want to go into it, let's figure out how to go legitimate and get a license. And coincidentally enough, New York State had just passed a law making it legal for kind of a path for craft distilleries to exist. And so put in an application in 2009, and in 2010 became the first whiskey distillery in New York City since Prohibition. And since then, kind of started with moonshine, but then always started aging whiskey. And now we make all different kinds of whiskeys, moonshine, but we also make bourbon, rye whiskey, a single malt Scotch style whiskey, and even a chocolate whiskey and some really kind of crazier things. And so I'll talk about those at the end of the talk when we do the sort of tasting. I know not everybody has whiskey at home, but I would, or our whiskey at home, but I would encourage you to just grab a bottle of any American whiskey or any whiskey at all and kind of taste along as we go through. And I'll talk a little bit about the history, and then I'll talk a little bit about, we'll go through the production floor with Gabby, who's actually at the distillery right now. She's our COO. And we'll kind of talk about the production process. And then, like I said, we'll come and do a little tasting and talk about what differentiates different types of whiskeys.
Awesome. So can you tell our viewers a little bit about what you've been doing right now, or is that going to be part of your tour? Because I know that
Sure, no, I think
made
that's
some accommodations.
Right. So, I mean, the irony of being a distiller is that you make this chemical called ethanol, which is very useful, and it's useful for drinking, and it's useful as fuel. It's 10% of most gasoline. It's useful as a solvent, and it's useful to kill germs. So hand sanitizer, the active ingredient, is 80% ethanol. And that, as a whiskey distillery, is more or less what we produce every day. And initially, when this whole thing broke, I think we didn't want to be seen as sort of being opportunistic and trying to get into sanitizer. But then it became clear that like hospitals needed sanitizer, and nurses were having trouble finding it. And so very quickly we converted our factory from doing whiskey to making hand sanitizer. So we've been doing that for the last 2 months, and have been distributing it all over New York City. My favorite is that we gave a bottle to everybody on the Staten Island ferry, like the crew. So, anybody like city workers, delivery people. I mean, we just kind of kept it pretty loose. FedEx guys, anybody who we came into contact with, anybody who asked, anybody who certainly was in a medical setting, we've been trying to give it away. But we also sell it on our website on a sort of pay what you wish kind of format. So if anybody needs hand sanitizer, I should say, go to Kings County Distillery, and we can ship it nationwide. So it's kind of a shame because you can kind of smell a little bit of the whiskey that it might have been. It does have a very moonshiny characteristic as far as hand sanitizer goes, but I don't know. That's what makes it.
Well, that's not such a bad thing, though, Colin, because I distinctly remember from when I went to my undergraduate school in Roanoke, Virginia, that's kind of very much like what moonshine smelled like and tasted like. So I think it's wonderful that you've been able to contribute in that way.
Yes, alcohol it has a very distinct characteristic, and no matter how you try to gussy it up, whether you're talking about fine old aged whiskey, the active ingredient is still pretty much the same thing. So it's important when talking about whiskey to remember that in a way you're kind of just finding ways to glorify drinking, which is important to sort of keep you honest. But yes.
I love it. So are we ready to go over to Gabby at the distillery?
Sure. Or maybe I'll just talk a little bit about kind of the history of distilling, give a little bit of context.
That'd be great.
Because we're a New York City distillery, and obviously when people think of whiskey, they think of Kentucky and Tennessee. And I'm here to say that is a little bit of a myth that has emerged in the last 100 years or so. But the great thing about whiskey is it's this really old it's a product that's been around for 400, 500 years. And so a lot of American history can be told through whiskey, and even urban in New York City we have a lot of history of distilling that's kind of interesting to talk about. So the first distillery in the United States was actually on Staten Island. So New York has claim to the first distillery in the United States. It was back in 1640 when we were part of the Dutch New Netherland Company. And we don't really know that much about the distillery, but we know that people drank beer in the taverns of New Amsterdam. And when you distill beer, it becomes whiskey. So that's one hypothesis. When the British took over in 1664, they built a lot of rum distilleries. And so really for that colonial era, there were rum distilleries in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, all kind of part of the triangular trade, the slave trade, a very exploitative sort of dark moment in colonial American history. But certainly the British colonial economy was really built on distillation and rum distillation, which is interesting. After the Revolutionary War, people got enthusiastic about whiskey because it was something you could make without relying on British sugarcane or molasses. And so American whiskey really developed first rye whiskey in the Northeast. And then as more and more distillers and people moved into the Ohio River Valley, kind of the West in the 1800s, that's when corn whiskey or bourbon started to kind of come into fashion as a style. Interestingly, in our neighborhood in New York, we're in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, it was a very heavily Irish neighborhood in the 1800s. And at the time of the Civil War, there was kind of an episode while Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury called the Whiskey Rebellion that happened in Pennsylvania. And George Washington had to send in 13,000 troops to put down this rebellion. And it basically made alcohol tax this very political third rail in American politics. But during the Civil War, the tax came back. And that's actually the tax that we pay today is really the same excise tax that has existed since the Civil War. And so from 1862 forward in American history, it's been illegal to distill outside of a commercial distillery, and to do so is to be a moonshiner. So that word moonshine existed in Europe and Scotland and Ireland and places like that, but didn't really mean anything in the United States until the Civil War. And so a lot of these Irish immigrants really felt like this tax was unfairly applied, and there were actually fairly significant riots that happened in Brooklyn around excise tax on whiskey. And they were known as the Whiskey Wars of Brooklyn. And they happened in 1868 to 1871 when a revenue officer was actually shot and killed while collecting whiskey tax. And that happened to be right outside where the distillery is, the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So there's a very sort of, substantial sort of history of conflict. Obviously, from that point on, then the trajectory for Prohibition begins to start as people view distillers as these sort of violent people who might at any moment, you might get caught in a moonshine raid and get, accidentally, shot at. And so the idea of distillers and moonshiners and kind of bootleggers as these people who were dangerous and lawless really fed the Prohibition movement. And then in 1919, Prohibition went into effect. Interestingly enough, right across the street from us, Al Capone was born in 1899. And he kind of grew up in the neighborhood where we are. It's called Vinegar Hill, but it's part of Dumbo is the sort of modern name for the neighborhood. But it was a heavily Irish neighborhood, became a heavily Italian neighborhood. And he kind of grew up, it was the sort of red light district. There were saloons, tattoo parlors, brothels, and kind of learned the bootlegging business, I would maybe argue, from that older generation of Irish immigrants who were still around. And then he moved to Chicago in 1920 and took that sort of bootlegging philosophy and made it into an organized national crime syndicate that got so out of hand that in 1933, the government repealed Prohibition. But what it did for urban distillers is that nobody could have a factory for 13 years that didn't produce anything. And so it was really the distilleries in the rural parts of the United States, most notably in Kentucky and Tennessee, that were the easiest to reopen after Prohibition. So before Prohibition, the big distilleries were in Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Louisville, a little bit in Philadelphia and Boston, but after Prohibition, it was really a little distillery in Loretto, Kentucky that today is Maker's Mark, or a little distillery in Claremont, Kentucky that became Jim Beam. So those were the distilleries that reopened quickly and kind of grew into these giant brands that we all kind of know. And a lot of the small distillers never reopened, or if they did reopen, they closed in the 70s when people kind of turned towards vodka and clear spirits as a sort of healthy alternative to whiskey. But ironically, now everybody's kind of turning away from vodka and back towards whiskey because it's perceived as having a lot of authenticity and a lot of character and is kind of independent of marketing. People are sort of suspicious of sort of vodka is all branding and whiskey is all, authenticity. And with that, a lot of small distilleries have opened up around the country. So in the 1980s, there were only about 13 distilleries making whiskey. Now there are somewhere in the order of 2,000 distilleries in the United States. Most of them are making whiskey, or let's say many of them are making whiskey. And so we've kind of returned from a place of a lot of diversity in the distilling industry that got clamped down to hardly any, a lot of very similar commercial products. And now we're getting back to an era where there's a lot more diversity, both in terms of product, but also geography. So not just Kentucky and Tennessee, but the Northeast, great whiskeys coming out of Texas, and the Pacific Northwest has we're developing our own sort of stylistic map of whiskeys, just as if you went to Scotland, there's kind of a map of Scotch whiskeys that are sort of regional. So that's kind of the future of whiskey, and that's a cool thing to be a part of helping to define and create within American whiskey. So I'm going to open it up to Gabby if she's there.
Yes. Hi.
So,
just flipping it over.
Gabby's actually at the distillery. I'm at my home office, and we've actually tried to limit the number of people that we allow into the factory, specifically because we're making this hand sanitizer. We really want to make sure that that we have only a certain number of people in each of our different spaces that we use to make all our different whiskeys, and specifically now sanitizer. So Gabby's going to kind of walk around, and I'll narrate what you're seeing. So she's in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It's where ships were built for the U.S. Navy all the way up until the 1960s, and then the land was given to the city of New York, or sold very cheaply to the city of New York, which has been developing it as a kind of small business incubator, and specifically manufacturing. So bringing back manufacturing jobs. During World War II, there were 70,000 people working in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I think today there's about 15,000 people. So the goal of the Navy Yard has always been to grow some of those jobs that were lost and really build the manufacturing economy of New York City, which is very important to its health. So what you're looking at right now is actually the back of our building. And that our building is the paymaster's office that was built in 1899, same year that Al Capone was born. And it was originally where people would pick up their paychecks after doing shipbuilding jobs or other sort of Navy Yard functions. But for the last 8 years, it's been Kings County Distillery. And so the most important thing to note from the back of the building are these two grain silos. And so now I'm going to kind of transition a little bit into how you make whiskey. And so,
Colin, I'm just going to pause you for 1 second because
yes,
we've got to switch over to Gabby, because even though you and I can see her, nobody else can. So we're just going to give it 1 second to let ourselves get caught up here. And while we're getting the gallery view so that we can see Gabby too, would you do me the favor of explaining, because I told you that I was privy to this conversation one day that some individuals were having about whiskey with an E and whiskey without the E, because I don't think anybody in that conversation came to a conclusion or a consensus. So I would love to hear your take for that while we get that set up appropriately so everybody can see what we're seeing.
Well, there are many things that are spelled differently between British English and American English, and whiskey is certainly one of them. Somehow this has taken on a much higher level of sensitivity than like the word theater or gray or color. And so the way that you want to spell whiskey becomes a proxy for whichever type of whiskey that you think is best. And so the Scots tend to spell whiskey without an E, and the Americans spell whiskey typically with an E. And when you go to Canadian whiskey and Irish whiskey, the rule of thumb is if you were friendly to the British Crown, you don't use the E. And if you were hostile to the British Crown, like Ireland or the United States, you spelled your whiskey with the letter E. But interestingly enough, when the US government writes its tax code and rules around whiskey, it does not use an E. So even the US government has sort of weighed in on the question. But we, as a sort of house style, use the E because it's just, we like American whiskey and we want to make American whiskey.
Well, thank you for clarifying that and for giving some basis for why I did not include the E in some of the things that I was posting to promote this. And I think now we can see the distillery. So I think you can pick back up and give folks just a little bit rewind.
Okay, yes. So that brick building is the distillery itself. That's where we're going to go inside and look at the production process. But I wanted to start outside just to give some context of where we are in the city, just right on the East River between Williamsburg and Dumbo. And then to point out these grain silos and our grain elevator, which you can kind of see in the back, that yellow pipe is actually, we'll get a tractor trailer's worth of 25 tons of New York State grown organic corn, roughly once a month. And so a tractor trailer will pull in right here. We'll move that sort of screw auger underneath the back of the tractor trailer, and as it lifts up, it will dump 25 tons of corn into both of these silos together. And we use about a ton of corn every day, a little less than a ton of corn, but that's the main ingredient for bourbon whiskey. And in fact, bourbon whiskey has to be made with at least 51% corn. And our recipe is usually 80% corn. So we use a lot more corn than is typical of maybe a Kentucky bourbon. Once a year, we'll get rye delivered. And rye is just a different type of grain, more historical to the Northeast. And this year, we'll probably do 2 full silos of rye grain, just because that's a really fastly growing popular category of whiskey, and bourbon is certainly still popular, but yeah. So I see.
We're back to just you again, Colin. Okay. So I'm sorry. I don't know for everybody that's watching. Zoom exhaustion is a real thing, and there are so many nuances to these live streams. So just bear with us for 1 second, and we're going to get back to Gabby. But I do want to tell you, Colin, that Eleanor just told us in the chat on Facebook that she purchased some sanitizer and whiskey from you last month, and she's pumped that there was a Yale connection. So.
Oh, great. Yes, good.
There's a Yale connection everywhere, guys. We know this, I think, right? We have some amazing Yaleys out there in the world. So just give us 1 second to bounce back to the distillery, and we'll keep going. And at the end of this, there's a reward, because Colin's going to tell you exactly what to drink tonight so that you can have a lovely nightcap. So give us just a minute, and you can continue on the tour. And there's another comment on Facebook I can share with you that says, Jennifer's a recent enthusiastic convert to bourbon. Looking forward to hearing more about bourbon. I don't know if you want to drop a little bourbon fact for her real quick.
Well, as a Kentuckian, bourbon is my favorite American whiskey, and certainly the most popular right now. I mean, bourbon is within all the categories. Spirits are growing more quickly than beer and wine, and within spirits, American whiskey and bourbon specifically is the fastest growing category. And I think people like it because it really, it's kind of very bold and flavorful, and very versatile, and not very fussy as opposed to other types of spirits. I mean, certainly brandy and scotch can be that way, but because bourbon is so American, people, and it pairs with very heavy sort of flavorful foods, which are kind of the way that food culture trends a little bit. So bourbon fits with a lot of other things that are going on in flavor, sort of culture, I guess I would say.
All right, we got Gabby back, Colin.
Good. Okay, great.
We got her back.
Okay, so while we have her, we'll go fast. The little steel hut that's right in front of her, there's actually a mill in there. It's a roller mill. And so the corn will get augered into that little building and get ground into cornmeal. And then from there, it will get augered inside the distillery. So Now Gabby's going into the distillery. And this is kind of, you can see where the magic happens here. So those copper machines, those are called stills, and that's really the most important thing in the distillery, because that's where the beer gets turned into whiskey. And actually, you can see those kegs of beer. We've been sourcing beer that's going stale from other breweries all around the city. So Bronx Brewery is another Yale-connected brewery in the Bronx. And they were one of the first people to jump in and say, hey, we've got some beer that we can't really sell. We have no bars and restaurants open. Why don't you guys turn it into hand sanitizer? And so they sent us a whole bunch of kegs. We loaded it into the still and turned it into hand sanitizer. Not whiskey, but again, there's not much of a chemical difference. So Gabby, if you could walk over to where the corn comes in and the little
Sure.
malt hopper. So if you can, I don't know if it's, so basically that white pipe that's going up to the ceiling, we'll drop the corn down into this little hopper, which in the sake of is what we'll call our small grains hopper, but what we put in there is barley. And so the other ingredient that we use for our whiskeys is barley. Most international whiskey is made from barley. And it's barley that's been malted. So that word malt I associate with Whoppers, but malted milk balls, single malt whiskey. A lot of beer is made from malted barley. So malt refers to grain that's been germinated, and by going through the process of sprouting, there are enzymes that convert starch to energy for the plant to grow. We can use those enzymes to convert starch to sugar. And we use sugar to make alcohol. So if you're distilling something from grain like whiskey, or fermenting something from grain like beer, usually there's a malted grain involved. And in our case, it's malted barley. So that's the other 20% of our recipe. So 80% corn, 20% malted barley. Corn comes from New York State. The barley that we use comes from England most of the time. I think this might be a Canadian malt that we were using some cheaper malt to make sanitizer. But we actually got back to making whiskey today or yesterday. So we're starting to mash in new whiskey. And so from that hopper, we'll go to the mash cooker. So basically 1,800 pounds of corn, 200 pounds of malted barley. That goes into this big tank, and it's cooked into a mash is the word for it. But any sort of breakfast mush that you like, cream of wheat, grits, oatmeal, you can turn any of that sort of grain mush into whiskey by fermenting it. And so the first step is just to break down a lot of those starches, add the enzymes that are the malted barley for the enzymes that convert it to sugar, and then we'll cool it back down to room temperature and put it into a fermenter. And so all it does in the fermenter, we have some, you can show the wooden fermenter.
Yeah.
They're easy to see.
While Gabby's showing that, we had a quick question, Colin, about single versus double malt.
Single malt is a word that really applies only to Scotch whiskey. Americans use it, and it could sort of mean anything in the United States, but in Scotland it means very specifically whiskey from a single distillery that's made only from malted barley. So if you're using malted barley and you were to add corn, you couldn't call it single malt. If you use malted barley and unmalted barley, you couldn't call it single malt. Or if you blended, and this is kind of cuts to the reason that the phrase exists, if you blend one distillery with another distillery, you can't call it single malt. So the Scots have a lot of particularities about where everything comes from, and part of our distillery likes to borrow from American culture, but a lot from Scotch culture, and Scotch is really good about transparency. And so we use a lot of that, some of the things that go into Scotch culture. So Gabby's looking at the fermenters right now. They're empty because we're just getting back to whiskey making, but these would hold about 500 gallons of fermenting mash. And by the end of the fermentation process, it'll be about 6% alcohol, and so not unlike beer. But one differentiation is we don't add hops. They're open to the atmosphere, so any sort of wild yeast, wild contamination, we're actually kind of into that, whereas most brewers would be sort of appalled. Because we're not going to drink that liquid. That liquid's going to go into the still to become, drastically chemically altered and purified. If you were on a desert island and you wanted to drink water that was contaminated, you would distill it for purity. So we're a little less worried than brewers are about that type of wild yeast contamination. And we actually kind of like it because it creates specificity and a lot of esters and a lot of things that really contribute to the flavor profile. So mashing takes about 6 hours. Fermentation will take about 4 days. So the liquid will sit in one of those wooden vats. We also have some steel fermenters behind the distillery that have more capacity. But that's essentially what happens during fermentation. So that 6% distiller's beer then goes into our stripping still. So Gabby's going to turn around and look at the stripping still. This is our newest still. We started with, we've used a lot of different stills over the years, but this is our kind of a very weird looking still. If you know Scotch whiskey or American whiskey, it's shaped this way. In part, it's a kind of Scotch style still, but it has this submarine kind of horizontal orientation, which is really kind of a moonshine thing. You'll see it in the Appalachian stills. That's kind of why I like it. But it was a way to fit a lot of capacity into a very old, weird building that didn't have a typical loading dock. So the door that it came through is that size. And so it had to fit through that door. So that was the primary constraint on how our still could look. So the way the still works is basically there's a coil of compressed steam that's about 230 degrees Fahrenheit, and that will boil the liquid to steam. And the fundamental thing about whiskey or distillation to know is that alcohol has a lower boiling point than water. So 173 degrees Fahrenheit, the alcohol will start to turn to alcohol vapor, steam, and that will boil off. And then it'll go up the top of that, what's called the Lin arm, into, on the right side, we have this little copper cylinder. That's called the condenser. And it's just a heat exchanger. There's vertical copper tubes that have cold water running through it. And all that steam will condense on it. It'll run down into this tote that we have at the bottom for collection. And we call that the low wines. So we take the 6% alcohol distiller's beer and convert it to about 20% alcohol low wine. And you say, oh, 20% alcohol, that's sounds good. Maybe we're
lethal is the word that comes to mind for me.
What does
personally.
that taste like? Okay, yeah. But it does not have a very good flavor profile. So we actually distill it again, and it'll go into one of these two stills. And these are really more traditional Scotch style in terms of their shape and orientation. And actually, we ran the distillery exclusively on these two stills for about 6 years. And we double distill our whiskey. The Irish would have you believe that triple distillation is superior. It's just more neutral. Every time you're distilling the spirit, you're getting closer to pure ethanol. And so a triple distilled will be a little bit lighter in body. A quadruple distilled will be lighter than that. And eventually, if you keep distilling, you just end up with vodka. So vodka is differentiated, not that it's made from potatoes. It's actually very often made from grain, but it's distilled so many times that it's very close to pure ethanol, usually 95% ethanol. And then it's cut down to 40% with water. And whiskey is actually distilled only to about 70% alcohol in our case. So we don't distill it to a very neutral place. We actually like it to have some of the flavor from the grain and the fermentation process that gives it sort of character. So what comes out of the stills on the second distillation, again, on average is about 70% alcohol. And the flavor and the nose of that whiskey is changing throughout the second distillation. And so the early part of the run has very sort of nail polish remover characteristics. In fact, acetone, which is nail polish remover, is one of the chemicals that's generated during fermentation. So we only collect the middle part of what comes out of the still, and the early part, which has a sort of solventy characteristic, and then the late part, which is sort of more compared to like skunky beer or something very funky. that's undesirable for another reason. So we take the heads and tails and set them aside. And the heart is what actually goes into a barrel to get filled up to make whiskey. So I don't know if we have any barrels lying around downstairs, but maybe Gabby, you should, oh, there we go. Yeah. So these are 53-gallon charred oak barrels from Missouri, or the cooperage is in Missouri, but it's drawn from forests all over that part of the sort of Midwest South. And they're charred on the inside. And so part of the law for bourbon and rye whiskey made in the United States is it has to be aged in a brand new barrel. So those, you can see they're kind of wrapped in plastic from the manufacturer. Those are new barrels from the cooperage, and we can only use them once to make bourbon or rye whiskey. And then most whiskey barrels go to Scotland or Ireland or other countries that make whiskey. And their laws usually say that they have to be aged in used barrels. So.
Oh, that's interesting. I have another question for you, Colin.
Yeah.
So the question is, do the wooden and stainless fermenters produce a different effect? Why both?
Why both is just that we grew bigger than the wood fermenters, and it was impractical to make wood fermenters that were 4,000 gallons. Although you do see them in Kentucky, we just didn't have the space for them in the building. And if we were going to put something outside, we didn't want it to be wood. I prefer the wood fermenters because they're just a little, they're less predictable. I'll phrase it that way. Whereas the steel fermenters, you know exactly what you're going to get. But the wood fermenters in the summer, they're hot, they're not temperature controlled, so you get a lot more variety in flavor. Whereas the steel fermenters are pretty regular. So this is the barrel room. This is not all of the whiskey that we have in total, but it tends to be the oldest whiskey and mostly smaller barrels because some human being has to actually lug those things upstairs. And we don't have an elevator in our building, so it's pretty impractical. And actually this row that Gabby's looking at right now, those are the oldest barrels that we have. And so we're about to release a 7-year-old bourbon, which will be the oldest bourbon outside of traditional bourbon country that's ever been released, or at least that's been released since Prohibition. And so one of those barrels, I think it's the second one there, is soon to get dumped as our first 7-year bourbon.
Is that like a very exciting moment for you?
Okay.
I feel like that's like a child that you're releasing out into the world in a way.
Yeah, I can't tell you how long 7 years really is. Feels like
like this quarantine, has that been 7 years? Because that's kind of how I'm feeling.
Yeah, I mean, add that to I mean, that barrel went through, I don't know, I think it's true that it also went through Hurricane Sandy, which was a big deal in New York. So that gives you a sense of the spread. It's Sandy to pandemic.
That feels in, I don't know how you would even begin to price something that's been through so many things.
Yeah, exactly. So most of the barrels are smaller, and actually the size of the barrel determines how long it will age, because there's a sort of there's more surface area for the amount of liquid that's inside them. And what happens in the barrel is it picks up it's kind of sap from the tree, and so there's kind of an infusion characteristic that's going on with the sugars and the caramelized sugars that are in the oak itself. So Gabby's looking at these samples that kind of show you as the whiskey ages. So that's 2 days, I think, 1 week, 2 months, 1 year, and then 2 years. The color, you gradually get color. But another thing that's happening is you get evaporation. And so I was saying the nail polish remover tends to have a lower boiling point than ethanol. So acetone, acetaldehyde, methanol, these are all compounds that have a lower boiling point. That tends to be what evaporates out first as the barrel sits. The barrels are waterproof, watertight, but not necessarily airtight. And so about 14% of what goes into the barrel will evaporate out over time. And that is the angel share, as it's called. There's not even a technical word for it, evaporation, I guess. But you could think of it that you're losing 14% of your whiskey, but you could also say this is the worst 14%, and that's the part that you want to get rid of. And it's kind of mellowing the whiskey by removing some of that volatile stuff. Another thing that happens in the barrel is the barrel actually absorbs some of the larger molecules, some of the fatty acids, esters, those things that higher boiling point alcohols, those things that would be in the tails of the run. So when you're doing the distillation, you're avoiding low boiling point chemical and high boiling point chemicals. Even during barrel maturation, those low boiling point chemicals and high boiling point chemicals are also being kind of removed from the whiskey. So that when the barrel's done, you'll end up with less volume, but you'll end up with a smoother spirit. So that's why people barrel age. But I am the first to say that whiskey doesn't necessarily ages different from maturity. And there are many great spirits made around the world. Silver tequila is probably the most commonly known spirit that's pot distilled, which is to say it's not vodka. It's got a lot of flavor and characteristic, but it's not aged. And so it's a lot like moonshine. And so I, as a distiller, have always been interested in unaged spirits because they take a lot more talent to make well, whereas any other spirit you can improve with aging. So once you take that crutch away, it's actually kind of, you have to change your process or your ingredients or something about what you're doing to improve the spirit. So I'll leave the distillery tour there if people have other questions, and Gabby, you can go ahead and drop off if you want. Thank you. Thank you for walking around.
No problem.
That was very, a little bit of a funny approach to this, but I think hopefully it worked for people.
I think everybody's kind of getting used to this weird world that we're living in. We're just happy to all be together tonight. Don't feel bad about it at all.
Right. So if anybody has any questions about, distillation or the science or process of distilling, I can answer that as I pour myself. I have some moonshine, which I'll pour since we're talking about white whiskey.
Awesome.
And I'll drop off. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you, Gabby.
Bye.
So now I feel like I have a lot to think about next time I actually get to go to a bar and order a drink, Colin. So
yeah, right.
tell us about the different notes and things that you're an expert on that I know nothing about.
Right. So I was talking about silver tequila, and this is moonshine or just unaged whiskey. If it's pot distilled, which is a sort of low proof distillation, you get a lot of oils and flavor components coming through the process that are very aromatic and really tell you about what it came from, but also how it was distilled. It's interesting that a lot of moonshine and a lot of tequila or really mezcal often tastes very similar because a lot of the process pieces are the same, even if the base ingredient is different. But moonshine is really, or like grappa, or I've always thought of moonshine as an American Southern thing, but in fact, once I started making it in New York City, all of these sort of Eastern European cultures would come and say, "Oh yeah, moonshine, we make that in my country," and we call it, any number of things. It's many cultures around the world have their moonshine, which is just either an unaged brandy or an unaged whiskey, and it's a kind of raw spirit, and it takes some getting used to, but I think it's most fun. And when I visit other distilleries, I like to try their white spirit because again, it shows me their sort of talent and ambition and what they're after. Whereas I feel like the whiskey world is always like, give me the oldest thing you have, when in fact you might actually learn more about whiskey by tasting the youngest thing, which is the unaged distillate. So our moonshine is very bright. It's got a sort of bright corn, even almost popcorn, but also like a corn husk characteristic to it. So it has kind of a farm. You kind of sense that sort of agricultural component that it comes from. And it's sweet. The corn is a great source of sugar, and a lot of those residual sugars carry through the distillation and end up in the spirit. So we mix this with a lot of, we do a margarita with it at our tasting room when we're open, And because it's a whiskey, but it tastes actually more like
a moonshine margarita.
Yeah, it's delicious.
I can't believe that no one that I went to college with ever attempted that. So that is a really interesting.
Well, I'm sure you know that people would they would put like fruit and
Yes.
like grapes or blackberries or, all kinds of stuff in moonshine to make it more palatable. And I think that is like where liqueurs came from. If you talk about, going back to like the European culture of moonshine, a lot of liqueurs and amaros and bittering cocktail ingredients really derive from ways in which people were trying to tame their moonshine. So I just poured the Kings County bourbon. So this is a New York bourbon. Bourbon is associated with Kentucky. And for a while I had to sort of talk people off the cliff that bourbon could be made outside of Kentucky. But the United States doesn't have laws like in Europe where certain products champagne can only come from Champagne, Scotch can only come from Scotland. Bourbon can be made anywhere in the United States. At this point, it is being made in at least 48 of the states. And for us, the challenge has been, how do you differentiate your bourbon from a Kentucky bourbon? How do you do something that isn't trying to replicate tradition? Craft beer is very distinct from commercial beer. The commercial beer is sort of watery and craft beer has a lot of flavor. Commercial bourbon is pretty good and is not necessarily asking to be improved on, but it's all very homogenous, I would argue. So there's kind of 3 classic recipes, and most of the distillers kind of stick to that, and there's not a whole lot of variation within that. So one of the things that we do is we do that pot style distillation as opposed to a column distillation, which is a little bit more efficient for a commercial distiller. And we use organic ingredients. We do narrow cuts off the still, and those things. And we use more malted barley and no rye or wheat, which would be typical of a Kentucky bourbon. So bourbon has to be 51% corn, distilled to a low proof, aged in charred new oak barrels for any amount of time, but straight bourbon has to be aged for 2 years. So Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey is whiskey made in Kentucky, 2 years old. So this is a straight bourbon. This is our kind of flagship bourbon, and it's our most popular. So that one has notes of cinnamon, nutmeg, vanilla, caramel, kind of Christmas spice, really sort of, good in the winter, good in the summer, good in the fall.
No bad time for this bourbon
Right.
is what
Right.
he's saying.
Yeah. But it's not super old. It's 2 years, which is actually pretty young compared to commercial bourbon. And our challenge has always been, well, we're never going to be that competitive on price or age. So where we can be competitive is through creativity. And so in addition to our regular bourbon, we make a peated bourbon. And that's a bourbon that uses a kind of peated malted barley that would be typical of a Scotch whiskey, like Lafroig or Ardbeg. You sometimes have those Scotches that are very peaty and smoky and have a real intense flavor. We use that type of malted barley to make a bourbon. So it's kind of a hybrid between Scotch ingredients in a bourbon. So it's somewhere kind of hovering between American whiskey and Scotch, or bourbon and Scotch. And that is our second most popular whiskey, and really kind of a whiskey nerd's whiskey, because nobody's ever made it before we did. And it really kind of does play around with your idea of bourbon has to taste this way or Scotch has to taste this way. What if you take them and kind of mix them together in a fun way?
That's super cool. I like that. So 2 years you said on that.
Mm-hmm.
How soon after you guys started were you able to actually distribute?
So that's a good question. Our first bourbon, we did kind of a like Christmas the first year, 2000. So we opened in 2010, and in April, and by Christmas we had a like 9-month bourbon that we just drank mostly amongst ourselves.
So fully like a child. So like exact same timeline. Got it. Okay.
Yes. And then for a long time we had a 1-year bourbon. Now we have a 2-year bourbon. And then in a second, I'll bring out our 4-year bourbon. So as a distillery, you're kind of always balancing this game of, you want to produce a lot of whiskey, but you want to harvest a little bit less than you're producing, because you want to gradually age your family of barrels. So we have about 3,500 barrels in total within our aging warehouse. The oldest of which is 9 years old. We have an 8-year-old that we're gonna release, 7-year-old. The 9-year, we're just gonna let it sit forever. And people will say, what's your oldest whiskey? We'll just say, whatever that barrel is. And that'll be fun. But practically, you can't just necessarily age all your whiskey as long as you want or as long as is the most appealing. So you have to produce some. And so we have 2-year, we have 4-year, we'll have a 7-year. Eventually we'll have a 12-year, but that will be, we're not quite there yet. But so one thing that I'll sort of talk about is this. So this is an Empire Rye whiskey. So I'll see if I can show you that little seal on the back of it. So rye whiskey is the style of whiskey that's native to the Northeast. And this was a project that was started by one of our blenders, Nicole Austin, who is now the head distiller at George Dickel in Tullahoma, Tennessee, which is one of those big sort of those 13 distilleries that were operating in the 80s. Dickel was one of them, and it's one of the old legacy heritage distilleries. It's a really cool spot if anybody gets down to Tullahoma. But anyway, when she was working for us, she had the idea with a couple other New York distillers. Nobody believes whiskey should come from New York. So let's band together and make a New York style of whiskey. And so that became Empire Rye, and that's what this is. So Empire Rye has to be 75% rye grown in New York State, distilled in New York State, and meet the criteria for straight rye whiskey from the federal government. And if you meet those criteria, you get that little seal on the back, and it can be called Empire Rye. And so I initially was sort of like, I don't know if this is a good project. It just sounds like rye made in New York. Who's going to care about that? But what I wasn't thinking about is Tennessee whiskey. So you pick up a bottle of Jack Daniels. It's not bourbon because they tell you it's Tennessee whiskey. What is Tennessee whiskey? It's just bourbon that has this little tiny tweak where they filter it through charcoal before they put it into a barrel. Arguably depending on how you do it, of almost inconsequential tweak. And maybe not in the case of Jack Daniels, but certainly in the case of Dickel. So it's a way to make Tennessee whiskey, which is otherwise just bourbon, somehow different, somehow more marketable. And with Empire Rye, which is a much, it's not a 150-year-old project, it's a 4-year-old project. It's a way to make New York spirits relevant and to kind of come together with our peers in craft distilling. Tom Potter is another Yale who runs New York Distilling Company, just crosstown neighbors. So he's making an Empire Rye. There's about 12 to 15 other distillers in New York State that are making this style of whiskey. And as I was saying at the beginning, this is the most popular thing we have, and we can barely keep it in stock. And in fact, it is sold out everywhere except one liquor store in Connecticut, Canterbury Liquors. So if you guys
all right,
know
how far is Canterbury from New Haven? We're gonna have to chart that out.
Maybe a ways, but it's close to Rhode Island, but you can check it out.
That's awesome.
So rye really is one of those fascinating whiskeys that it's associated with Pennsylvania and Maryland, but it really died out. There are no distilleries making rye today in the historical region where rye is from that are older than 15 years old. And all the brands of rye that are on the shelves, like Old Overholt or Rittenhouse or any of these, they're all made in Kentucky at bourbon distilleries. And they run the bourbon for 364 days out of the year, and then 1 day or 2 days they make rye whiskey. And that's pretty much all of the rye that's available. So it's kind of a style of whiskey that the cocktail community really discovered, because a lot of these old drinks manuals called for rye whiskey, and there wasn't much in the market. So a lot of craft distillers have really ramped up with rye because there's kind of an opportunity for it, and also a story for us because it's where rye is historically from. So that's a fun whiskey. And then the last one that I'll try here and share with you guys is a bottled in bond whiskey. And if you take away anything from this discussion, I would say it's that bonded spirits are a great, usually a great marker of authenticity. So one of the tricky things about, and this is true with a lot of like beer, wine, coffee, where there's sort of the illusion of artisanship. And in fact, you're getting something that's made at a huge commercial facility and it's sort of posing as something small and craft. And that is remarkably true in the whiskey space, is that there's many, many different brands that are really just buying more or less finished whiskey and just bottling it under a sort of handmade label. But this has been a problem in whiskey going back to the 1880s, 1890s, probably since whiskey began. And the first Consumer Protection Act in the United States was the Bottled and Bond Act. Whiskey back in the 1890s was medicine, or sort of medicine, and people felt like it had to really be protected. And so the distillers, the craft distillers of that era, which were the Kentucky distillers, got together and said, let's come up with a craft certification. And so what they carved out was the Bottled and Bond Act. So if it's distilled by one distiller at one distillery in one distilling season, you can call it bottled and bond if it's 4 years old at exactly 100 proof. So one person, one place, one span of time. So single malt Scotch we talked about earlier is from one distillery, from one grain. This says this is from one distillery, from one human being distiller, and not just from one grain, but from one season of crop. And so that's where bottled and bond comes from. And it was insanely popular before Prohibition. Prohibition kind of dampened its opportunities, and it became kind of a bottom shelf thing. But now that distillers have really wanted to distinguish those that are making it from scratch from their sort of peers that are just rebranding other commercial whiskey, Bottled and Bond says, hey, this is something that we made. It's fully transparent, you know, where it was made, when it was made, who made it. And it kind of speaks to a lot of what people are excited about in American whiskey. And actually Nicole, who, when she went to George Dickel in Tennessee, her first whiskey that she did there was a bonded George Dickel, and it won Whiskey of the Year last year from Whiskey Advocate, which is the big sort of whiskey magazine that people read. So that was kind of a nice story that you know, to have that style then come from craft and go back to the big distillers, because in fact they want to show that they're authentic too, and that they have a hand in making what they make. So so yeah, so that's basically the kind of 3 styles of American whiskey, or 4 styles of American whiskey. We also make really weird stuff like a chocolate whiskey. We make a jalapeno grapefruit moonshine. We make a barrel proof whiskey, which is 63% alcohol, which people love. And so we're always experimenting. We're just coming out with a bottled and bond Applejack, which is a distilled apple brandy. So part of our program as distillers, I guess, has been to be very creative and open to, we'll kind of try anything, and a lot of times it'll stick and we'll turn it into a product. And I think we've become known within craft whiskey, not just as a local whiskey to New York, which we are, but as a really people who are trying to expand the category of American whiskey and just kind of push that definition past the place where it's been for 50 to 100 years. And so we're doing that with peated bourbon. We have a sort of single malt Scotch style whiskey that, you know, it's kind of figuring out what that might taste like if it were made in the United States. How much does terroir, or that sense of geography, actually affect the flavor of whiskey? I think that's an open question that people are curious to answer. Distillers are curious to answer through the products that they are making. And so Empire Rye is kind of a part of that too. What does New York rye whiskey taste like? Does it taste any different? So the fun of being a distiller right now is not necessarily just making whiskey, which of course it is, and even waiting for older whiskey to come due, which it also is. But it's also more, how do we help articulate what whiskey can be for the next generation. And the fun of that is that whiskey has been around for so many generations. It feels like we're participating in this very old, very traditional, very beautiful process and sort of practice, discipline. And so that's kind of what keeps me excited about it, enthusiastic about it.
I have two questions for you, Colin.
Okay.
One is single barrel whiskey is offered by some distributors. Is there really any significant difference between from barrels at the same distillation run? I hope it is.
Right. That is a great question. And I love that question because I'm the first skeptic of all the mythology around spirits marketing, and single barrel is one of those that just is kind of like, really? And I'm here to say that it does make a difference. 2 barrels filled the same day from the same distillation run could taste wildly different. And why that is, I don't necessarily even have a good answer for, but for the particularities of the grain of the wood, maybe where they sit is slightly different in terms of the temperature that they go through while they're aging. We find that there is a fair amount of differentiation from multiple barrels. And therefore, the single barrel notion is certainly that the single barrel is singular. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better. And it depends entirely on the sensory analysis of the barrel that's being done by the blender or the person who's in charge of sensory analysis. So it doesn't matter whether you make great whiskey if you don't have somebody who can jump on it and say, oh, that's a great single barrel. Let's pull that out of the line and share it with, a retailer who, we have a great, I'll say, going back to Connecticut, there's a great retailer, Harry's in, I think he's in Westport. And we do a single barrel program with him, and he comes to the distillery and really has a great palate, and we'll really work through the samples. And I have every confidence that when they pick a barrel, it's going to be a great barrel. So, but a lot depends when you're talking about single barrels on who's tasting them and what they're looking for, because every palate is very different. So ultimately, we perceive whiskey as this thing where there's some great whiskey and everybody's searching for that great whiskey. But in fact, every person's great whiskey is very different.
So to that end, when the world somewhat resumes and people can go about tasting as they'd like, what are you guys doing when you're back up and running? You do tours and tastings at the distillery?
Yeah, so our tours include a tasting at the end of 5 different whiskeys. We have a cocktail bar / tasting room where you can taste through flights of whiskeys, or if you don't really care that much, we can just make you a very nice cocktail. And it's the tour that you take goes into a lot of that. It's a very nerdy, geeky tour, which I'm very proud of. And I think even if you don't think that you like whiskey, there's certainly going to be something in it for a Yale, I would guess, because we go into so many tangents on history and culture and science and art and
because your liberal arts degrees have served you well.
Right.
I think I might have read that in an article that you said that.
Well, let's say it became a practical way to engage with people, because in fact, not everybody wants to drink like straight whiskey like this. So to make it more fun and to make it, more of an experience, we really kind of leaned into the things that we could, but we found all that great New York history that if we hadn't been, that really was forgotten. So the fact that we're here to tell that story is a great opportunity to kind of resuscitate a part of history that had been kind of lost a little bit.
Well, I'm going to work up the courage to try a moonshine margarita when you reopen, because I have the pleasure of working with the Yale Club of New York City. So I think this is a point. If anybody has any last minute questions, we're going to let everybody get off to their own bars and living rooms to settle in for the evening. If there's any questions, feel free to drop them in. Otherwise, Colin, thank you so much for your time tonight, and to Gabby too, extend our thanks. We're having a lot of fun doing these Yale Alumni Lives. I don't see any other questions, but Colin and I will be in the Zoom for a few minutes if anybody does want to ask a question. And again, this is Colin Spoelman from the Kings County Distillery celebrating 10 years. And this is another Yale Alumni Live event. If you want to see more events like this, go to the Yale Alumni Association website. We have Chef Mark Tafoya coming up on June 3rd, who's going to be teaching a cooking class. And we just recently made a agreement to have Jen Kramer, who is a Las Vegas magician, if you can believe it, join us on June 17th. So we're really excited for those of you who were able to join us. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Yale Alumni. And we really hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie.
All right. Awesome. I think Kevin's going to take us off of Facebook Live. Hopefully,
Cool.
he's still here. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. There's so much to learn.
I know it's a lot. Whoever thought that whiskey had that much going on?
It's like a lot of rules and regulations and nuances and all these different things. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's. I mean, the history thing. I mean, I could go on for history. I could do a whole thing on that.
Yeah.
But like the law and American politics and culture and whiskey, it's a narrative that isn't necessarily taught in elementary school. But once you sort of look back on it, you're like, wait a second, everything was about whiskey all along, or about distillation one way or another. I mean, Prohibition. I mean, it's just these great, huge moments in history that, I mean, even the Civil War, in its own way, there were aspects that had to do with, cultural disputes in the Northeast, not necessarily in the South, but, the whiskey wars were Irish immigrants who were often Democrats and immigrants versus the Republicans of that era, who tended to be, Union sympathetic natives, so kind of the gangs of New York era of history.
Right.
And the Irish were all distillers. That was their cultural profession. So
interesting.
Yeah, so they were kind of targeted with the excise tax during the Civil War because they were all Democrats.
It all goes together, doesn't it? All those threads. Well, I think Kevin is going to take us off of Facebook Live. So if anybody is still watching us on Facebook Live, we have ended for the evening, but this was recorded and will be posted on the Yale Alumni website. So Colin, if you'd like to sign off, I thank you so much for your time. And I truly do hope to be able to get out to see you guys in New York in the very near future, because we can't take this any longer.
Same here.
All right, well, I'll let you. Thank you. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.